Hey robot fans, welcome back to the build. Last time we got the ab piece and the cod piece all set up, and today we're going to do the chest, the last piece of the Imperial Surplus hard armor kit. We're going to paint that blue stripe down our chest with all the power of the Republic. Here you can see all the parts we're going to be working with in this video. We have the chest and back armor parts from Imperial Surplus. We also have this resin cast back greebly from Imperial Surplus, which will be installed into the back plate. And we have this silicone strap kit from Sanitized Creations, which will hold the two parts together. I'm going to kick this process off by cutting out the back panel to prep for the resin plate. The part that needs to be cut is pretty clearly outlined here, so I just emphasized this a bit with a pencil and some blue painter's tape before I took it outside for dremeling. I used a plastic cutting wheel to cut through pretty close to my tape line and then did some hand sanding just to smooth it all out. Now this resin plate here is just going to be glued behind this reveal that we cut. I did some test fittings to make sure the plate was trimmed properly, and I sanded down some of the rougher edges and faces to make it nice and smooth and ready for paint. Then I measured the exact dimensions of the opening I cut and centered those dimensions on the plate to make sure when I go in to glue it, it's perfectly centered. I placed a painter's tape mask about 1/8 of an inch outside of those lines to give myself a bit of a bleed. I'm going to keep this tape on during the painting process, so I will still have a rougher sanded resin surface to glue onto the ABS rather than a smoothed down painted section. Right about this time, I took a closer look at Gatz's backplate on the C.R.L. and was greeted with a nice little Gatz detail. Inside of his circle vents, he has these little circuit boards with copper wiring routed about to make some really cool looking circuitry. As someone who makes very similar perf board circuits all the time, I think I just found my new favorite part of this build. I immediately drilled out the remaining resin inside of those circles so I can make my own little circuits behind them. And while I was staring at Gatz's DW back kit, I found myself being a bit more partial to the DW vent structure on the right over here. The KW one is pretty good, but I think these parts are really thin, so during the casting process it made some of these lines a little wonky, so I'm just going to cut this whole thing out too and print my own DKW hybrid part. I used the same Dremel cutting wheel to cut out this square as best I could, and with all of this stuff cut out we can get right into filling them back up. For the circuit portion, I'll be using these two proto boards I had on hand. They are basically just solderable breadboards. If we look at Gatz's reference, there appears to be an alternating orientation of the copper pads. So I'm going to cut both of these boards in half so I can achieve the same effect. I'm also going to give them a quick spray down with some of the gray automotive paint we've been using so far throughout this build for some of the darker grays. Just a light coat to add in some of the color over the black. When that's done, I take some sandpaper and re-sand out the copper pads. Just doing this alone adds in all the weathering I need for this panel. Next, I took out some thin copper wire and soldered in a bit of a radial pattern on the first board, checking to make sure it still fit into the circle enclosure. For the DKW vent greebly, I printed this piece which will slide right into the recess. This will remain white, so I can just paint this alongside the white coat for the main structure. When the whites are fully dry, I hit the resin plate with Chiron Global Blue to match the rest of the 501st blue we have in the kit. I did my main weathering pass before installing all the greeblies, mostly just sanding off some of the edges of the blue to reveal the white paint below. Then I glued in all the greeblies and did my darker weathering pass, adding in some scuffs and some dirt accumulation. Boom, look at this. I'm really happy with this back plate. It's kind of a shame that it won't even be seen after we add in the radio pack in the next video. Oh well. Now onto fitting the main chest and back pieces. I did some more test fitting in front of the mirror just like I did for the ab and cod pieces. The chest is going to sit on top of the ab piece in the front, and the back plate is going to sit on top of the kidney plate in the back. So it's very important to have all of this in place when measuring stuff out. When I had things taped up in place the way that I wanted them, I made some lines to mark the armor overlap. Back on the table, I recreated that taped up setup. Just like we did with all the other previous armor pieces, we're going to make a straight center line in this overlap. However, unlike all the seams we have done this far, these seams will not be filled in. These seams are going to remain a visible part of the build, so we're going to need to put some extra care into making these cuts nice and smooth. I want the seam to be as absolutely vertical as possible, completely perpendicular to the ground plane, and I want the line to be totally centered between the two uprights of the back and the chest. If we're gonna make a seam, we're gonna make it right. I did this on both sides, and then I began to make my cuts. Okay, so I was just about to do my cut, and I noticed something interesting. When I did the test in the mirror, I aligned the parts just like this, and we made this diagonal line, which represents where everything should meet to make the cut. And I was just about to make that cut when I realized, if we look at this outside edge here, this outside of the return edge, this is what we're trying to line up. And you can see here they do perfectly line up, but they meet right here, which is way towards the front of the curve. Now we want the seam to be dead in the center of this curve, so these two top return edges need to meet dead in the center, and that's not happening here. So while this is the good line to get the closure that we want, we need to shift this armor down, because now you can see these return edges meet more towards the middle. So when things are like this, overlapped the way you would just naturally overlap them, if we look at the inside, we can see that the return edges meet way towards the front of the chest. But we can see that as we move everything down, the meeting of this return edge moves further along the curve. And right now these things are meeting right about here. And I made this mark, this perpendicular line, and if I line up the edges to that and that, now we can see that these return edges are meeting pretty much right in the center of the curve, which is what we want. If we look at the inside, we can see the same thing. So I can see already, just by doing this, how much the fit is going to be affected. So I'm going to do another test fit with everything taped like this, where the return edges are meeting in the center of the armpit area. I'm happy to say that even with the little changes in angle, everything still fits pretty well, albeit a little more snug, but it actually feels really nice and sturdy, so I'm going to keep it like this. The overlaps look a lot better, and I'm much more confident now to go in, redraw those lines, and make my final cuts. To cut the sides, I'm using these awesome little armor scissors I discovered at a local build party recently. They're super small and light, but can cut through this armor like butter. I'll put a link in the description. You definitely want to get a pair of these. Now, if you're following this build series, and I hope that you are, hit that subscribe button. There's a part of almost every video where I say, here's where I'm going to do my own thing, or here's where I go off the beaten path a little. That is this part of this video. If we look back to the last video where I was making the ab, I cut the ab way too short, and it left this huge gap. So rather than build up the two sides individually and make them meet in the middle, I printed a single shim that rejoined the two sides and made the ab piece one continuous ring again. When that was all sturdy again, I took a Dremel and I recut the seam through this thicker printed piece of plastic. This wasn't intentional, but it left me with a really awesome, thick, sturdy back seam. Every time I take the Velcro off now, or anytime I'm working with this seam, I'm always conscious of how much sturdier it is than the rest of all of the parts of the build, and I'm really, really happy with this. I want to do something similar for the chest seam, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to reuse these pieces of plastic that I just cut off the back piece, and I'm going to seal up both sides again. This is going to give me a few advantages. One, it's going to let me rebuild all of the plastic around the seams. If we look back to the legs video, I rebuilt the bottom of the seam of the thigh, and it gave it a nice rounder edge that otherwise wouldn't have existed. I'm going to be running into the same problem here with the chest where they're not quite lined up. So when they're all glued together, I can rebuild all of these lines and make them nice and smooth and make the curves really good, and then I can recut the seam right down the middle. This will give me a straight seam since it's being cut out of one piece instead of out of two separate pieces, and it'll also make that sturdier seam that works really well when you're trying to connect and disconnect these pieces all the time. So rather than use my scrap white pieces, I decided to print some more custom fitting shims. I printed out these two black pieces. They are about 1.5 millimeters thick and they are solid ABS plastic. Before I glue them in, I'm going to do a little forward thinking here and install these two male end snaps into the shims, which will help down the line as we get into the closures. Now it's just a matter of gluing the shim onto the two armor pieces as we've done so many times before, and then using my ABS sludge I will fill in this gap, strengthen the connection, and also start building up those sides and smoothing out that transition. I repeated this process over and over, just building up and sanding down until things started looking good. Okay, so I've done a few rounds now of just building this up and sanding it back down. We're starting to get a nice smooth edge. All of the curves along the bottom and the top are starting to match up really nice. I'm going to keep going with this. I'm going to even do a round of the gray Rust-Oleum primer on both of these sides just to get everything nice and smoothed out. I want to get rid of this seam completely if I could, because if you notice, I think they are actually moving backwards a little bit instead of straight up and down. So when I recut the seams, I don't want to be influenced by my old seam. I want to just have a nice smooth surface and I can really dial in where this seam is going to be. Before I do that gray Rust-Oleum primer, there is one little detail that I want to add in now. There are 2 holes that need to be cut into the right of the chest. If you buy your armor from Imperial Surplus, these holes will be nicely indented, and I just drilled through each of those indents in a couple of spots and used some snippers to connect them, and used a combination of sandpaper and needle files to smooth it all out. With our chest holes properly holed, we can do a little priming and further smooth everything out. Okay, we're all set here. Everything is nice and sealed up. These lines are nice and continuous on the top and bottom of both sides. So the next step is to draw my new cut lines and make sure that they are nice and straight and vertical. Then I'm going to take my Dremel and cut these lines as absolutely straight as possible. I think this is arguably the most important cut I've made throughout this entire build. When that was all cut, I tried doing some general test fittings around the ab to check the seams and sizings, and I kept running into an annoying problem. Every time I set this up, whether it was on the table or on my body, the ab is always in a slightly different position, and it's causing me some mixed results. Before I do the final fitting, I want to take that big step that I've been avoiding and attach the ab to the cod piece. I positioned the ab exactly how I wanted it, and I drew a line marking the position. Here's that line that we just drew, so we have a good indication of where we need to glue our cod piece onto. I also made a center hash mark here. This center is the center line of the ab piece, and I made a matching center line piece right here on the cod. I don't know if you can see that, but so I'm going to line these up, and it's tricky because the angles are fun. You have to make sure that the tilt of the cod is perfect, otherwise it won't align. So I'm glad I drew out this line as big as I did so I can get a good idea of how tilted off this has to be in the position that I need it to be in. I know I'm pretty partial to using ABS sludge to glue things together, but I think for this particular piece I'm going to use some super glue with some accelerator, because I don't think I want to hold this into place for as long as it'll take the sludge to dry. So I'm gonna sand off everything below this line, get it nice and rough. I'm also gonna sand the inside of the cod piece, and then I'm going to do a few dabs of glue in all 3 of the spots, and then once that's kind of firmly locked into place, I will reinforce everything with my good old trusty ABS sludge. With the cod in its final spot, I'm noticing the chest is fitting just a smidge tighter than I would have liked, so I'm going to add in about a ½ an inch of material to the overall circumference. To do this, I'm going to take these shims, which measure about 2 millimeters each in thickness, and cut them to a rough shape of the edge of the chest and just ABS weld it on. When it was all dried up, I trimmed off the excess from the outside and reinforced, and then when that was dry, I trimmed off all the excess from the inside and reinforced. I did this on all 4 edges, and actually did this twice on the back 2 edges, giving me an extra 12 millimeters all around. You can see the little addition here, as well as our nice thicker edges for our chest closures. For closing up the chest armor, I'm taking a page right out of the GATS handbook. Master Clone Builder Commander GATS is the C.R.L. model for Commander Bao, and I've been lucky enough to have some guidance from him on a lot of this build. When he showed me how he closes up his chest seams, I was super impressed, and I knew I was going to do the exact same thing on my build. It starts with this C-shaped bracket. I measured it to fit the full height of the side of the chest, and the bracket has one of my little snap butts on it I used in the previous video to hold the cod piece onto the butt piece. This snap butt is measured to fit directly over the snap that we installed earlier into our black ABS shims. I printed a pull tab shape, which I will trace and cut out of a spare piece of ABS. The molded ABS is much stronger than the printed ABS is, and since this pull tab will be pulled and yanked on quite a bit, I want it to be as strong as possible. The pull tab fits over the snap butt, and with the addition of a 4mm hole, we can glue the tab onto the butt and sandwich it with the female end of the snap. I snapped the bracket into place and then traced where the legs landed on the back armor, glued it down, and let it dry. So now that is glued into place, and we can see that we can connect our 2 sides here and snap this into place, and everything fits, which is good. So I glued it in the proper position. I might need a little sanding here, but this fits. But you see it kind of wants to overlap like this. So that's where piece number 2 is going to come into play. This piece is going to glue in right here, and it's going to glue to the side that the other piece is not glued onto. And there's a little lip on here. You can see it's a little taller on one side than it is on the other. That is what's going to hold this into place. It's going to slide over and pop down over that lip, and that's going to prevent everything from moving and sliding, and it should keep everything nice and secure. And then when everything's done, I can just reach in, pull up this pull tab, and boom, everything snaps out. After tracing out the shape of this second piece, I glued it down onto the chest armor and let it dry overnight. So now with both sides in, it's just a matter of sliding that tab in there and then snapping it shut. Okay, I went ahead and did the same thing on the other side, and now installing the whole chest together is just a matter of lining up that snap, slotting that through, snap, snap. And that's all there is to it. It's nice and sturdy, doesn't wobble, the seams look good on both sides. Gats is a genius. And the fit is really nice too, which was a bit of a concern. For me, the kiss of death on some builds that I see are these big, bulky, puffy chests that don't fit properly. If nothing else fits, the chest needs to fit. It's such a crucial piece to the overall look, and I was concerned that given my fluffier frame that I was going to need to have one of these ill-fitting chests to accommodate, but I'm relieved and really happy with how well this is sitting. I'd be lying if I said I didn't stand in front of this mirror for a good 20 minutes just admiring the cloniness of it all. But we need to get back to work here, and we need to figure out these straps which connect the chest to the back over the shoulders. For this, I'm using the Sanitized Creations silicone strap kit, which requires a little bit of cleanup in the beginning. The Imperial Surplus website shows where to make our cuts and our holes, but we are not using the Imperial Surplus straps, so these will be a bit different. For the front, I decided just to draw in a rough shape of the sanitized strap and then sand it out to its final position. For the back, I simply lined up the butt end of one of the straps and traced out the outline to remove enough mass to allow the strap to push through. As far as mounting, these straps are going to anchor to the back armor and have a snap attachment to the front armor. I don't want the straps mounted for the painting process, so we'll worry about the back anchors later, but I do want to get the snaps in the front set up before I paint anything. Now the goal here is to have one of these horizontal edges sitting nicely on top of this edge right here. I could just line up the butt end of the strap like this, but as the strap bends back, the butt end becomes very visible. We don't want to see no butts. So I'm going to cut into the silicone strap about halfway. This is very similar to what I did on the elbow strap. And I'm going to cut right down to the floor of the strap pattern, the length of one of these horizontal bars. This will leave some material behind on the bend and give a little more friction to hold the strap into place a little bit better. I printed one of my trademarked snap butts, which will be glued and anchored to the white webbing with a female strap, just like we did on the sides. I also printed some thin ABS shims with some male end straps installed in them. I'm going to carefully align the position of this shim to where the snap will naturally fall and then glue and clamp it down. Now we will have a perfectly placed male snap right inside of the chest, which will give us our desired strap placement on the chest. Now we can start on our paint process. There's really nothing new to see here at all. Check out my arms video for more on that whole process and how I paint every single part of this build. Basically, it's just sanding and priming and then painting everything with Krylon Fusion to get it to a nice smooth white. When both of those pieces have fully cured, I installed the back plate into the back armor and began doing some measuring for the big chest stripe. I am so excited for this part of the build. This is like the crown jewel to be placed atop my finished armor. The C.R.L. calls for a stripe that is about 1 3/4 wide at the top of the chest, flaring out to 3.5 inches wide at the bottom of the pecs here, and a full 6 inches wide at the base of the chest with a little flare going along the bottom edge. I made some initial measurements and began taping with my thinnest of thin painter's tape to outline the main shape. As soon as I got this taped up, I could see something was not looking quite right. These flare outs here are way too big. So I shot a message over to Gats, and he said that his measurements come from his chest, which is from a different maker. He has DW Designs armor, and I have Imperial Surplus armor. So he said the best thing to do would be to re-measure mine and just make them proportional to what his look like. I looked at some other builders who have Imperial Surplus chests like mine, and theirs are much shorter than this. So right now, the C.R.L. calls for 3.5 inch flare out. I have that 3.5 inch measuring from this interior point out to here. I think I'm going to change that 3.5 inch to measure from this point out to somewhere about here. And that'll shorten this flare out a little bit. I want to keep it in line with this chest like that. So I think this 3.5 will make this line a much more smoother line. So yeah, this line, this mark right here, is the 3.5 inch mark from this point. But I made a tape line that tries to follow this chest line right down. And that comes out just a little bit further than that line. And the C.R.L. does clearly say about 3.5 inches. So I think I'll be okay with this line. Visually, I think it's going to look a lot nicer if this is in line with this rather than be a precise measurement that seems kind of arbitrary since I'm moving it around anyway. Following the lines of the chest looks way better already, so I think this is definitely the way to go. I built up the rest of the tape around my initial thin tape and added in some brown paper to cover over the bulk. With the main shape outlined, I can begin measuring and taping out the internal white stripe, which will make our final A shape. The C.R.L. has some pretty specific measurements for this stripe. It's 1.5 inches wide and starts 1/4 of an inch below the center of the pecs. There is a 1/2 inch divide in the stripe that starts 3/8 of an inch down. I measured everything out and used 2 strips of 3/4 inch painter's tape to make my stripe and then carefully sliced out the top edge and the divide. If you've been following this build series, you'll know that in the beginning of the build I was using the common liquid latex method for masking off the battle damage. I did this on both the helmet and the shoulder bells. I've kind of abandoned that since, and I have been making my battle damage manually, which I think is working a bit better for me with regard to realism. I'm going to go without liquid latex on the main chest section here as well, and worry about scuffing it up all later with some sandpaper. Ready to paint now, I spray the whole thing down with a round of white paint to seal off any bumps and imperfections in my tape line, and when that is dry, I spray some light coats of Krylon Global Blue, which is the blue I've been using to get that 501st Battalion look. Now for the moment of truth, the moment I've been waiting for this entire build, revealing the chest stripe. This really is the best part of the process for any of these painted parts, no doubt about it. Unfortunately, this will be the last blue masking of this build, so I am enjoying it as much as I can. The blue A-shaped stripe looks awesome down on this chest, and now we can dive right into the weathering and make it look like the rest of the armor. For the weathering, I'm using my usual Thun-Gatzian approach. For more on that, check out the legs video that came out a few videos back. I'm trying to think somewhat logically here about where damage would actually occur on this armor. So I'm adding most of the damage to the front plate where it's not protected by the arms, because some blaster marks and shrapnel are sure to hit there at some point. Similar to what I was saying in the last video, I think I'm going to have to revisit the weathering of this entire combined torso when I have the final belt in place to make sure things look correct and cohesive between all the parts. But I think this damage on the chest is looking really good, and it'll be a nice centerpiece for setting up the rest of that weathering. After I have all of my Gatzian style lines in place, I do my usual Thuntonian airbrushing all around to add in that vignette contrast that I love so much. This piece is pretty huge, and I spent a lot of extra time going over all the individual areas and edges, making sure things looked consistent and weathered. I think it's looking good now, and we can move on to our final strapping. I am not impressed with silicone. I got a little taste of this with the elbow straps, and I kind of was able to gloss over it, but now I'm really struggling with these shoulder straps. I tried a lot of the usually suggested methods for painting silicone, trying to get a layer of white on here so that I could get some consistent weathering between the silicone strap and the plastic armor, but of course nothing is sticking to the silicone, just like nothing ever sticks to silicone. After a bit of noodling, I think I found something that actually does work though, which is great. Here is a silicone belt that I've been testing a lot of these methods on, and I think I've managed to successfully get some paint to adhere to this. I don't think I could do anything super special with regard to color matching or painting in fine details, but for adding black weathering to white silicone, I think I found something that works. I'm going to start this on my shoulders by gluing a black ABS shim to the back of the silicone strap. The first thing I did was brush down the entire back of the strap with 100% mineral spirits. I've read that this kind of roughs up the surface of the silicone, making it at least that much more workable. A fellow builder named Scott Jarbo mentioned this silicone-based glue on one of his build posts, and I picked some up. It claims to stick to anything, and they wouldn't lie, right? So I'm using this to glue the shim down to the back of the silicone strap. The shim is really thin and flexible, but it will give the strap a hint of rigidity, which I think will be really helpful down the line. The glue has a super long 12-hour cure time, so we're going to take advantage of that a little bit. While the shim glue is setting, I begin setting up my paint process. We are using the same glue and the same mineral spirits along with some acrylic paint to create a bit of a pigmented glue. I put a glob of the glue into the base of a solo cup and mixed in some mineral spirits. I kept the glue and the mineral spirits mostly separate for the time being. I didn't stir them all together or anything. Then the general idea of this is to get a glob of glue, swish it around to dilute it in the mineral spirits, creating a thinner, liquidy glue on your brush. Coat the strap with that mixture and then use the paint to color the glue. When it dries, the silicone should seal that color in. That's what I did on this belt, and a week later I still can't get the paint off even if I try. This process is very loose. Sometimes I add the paint on first and then mix the glue on top. Sometimes I just cover the whole section that I want to paint with glue and then paint on top of that. But overall, I just made some general weathering inside the grooves of the strap and then tried to do some Gatzian lines on top in certain places. I think it was mostly successful for what I need, and here you can see a comparison between the finished strap and the untouched strap. When the process is done, the whole strap is tacky and still drying, so rather than place it down somewhere flat to dry, I tossed the whole strap shim down onto my hot printer bed to soften up that plastic shim on the back. After it was sufficiently heated, I snapped the strap into place and bent it backward into a position much more resembling its final position. Now I will let that plastic cool, and I will let the 12-hour cure time glue set overnight in this curved position. Sure enough, when I removed them in the morning, the curve held up pretty nicely. Now the plastic is cooled and the glue is cured into this position. The absolute last thing we need to do here is figure out our back anchors. I installed some more snaps onto the back of each of the straps to snap them into place, but decided to ultimately go with Velcro for now. I want to get a feel for how they fit and where I want them to lay before I come up with a permanent mount. I'm happy with the flexibility of the Velcro. All suited up now, and I'm feeling pretty good. The chest fits really nice, and I think it's intermingling well with all of the other parts. Mobility is way down, but I can still put my helmet on and take it off all by myself, which is great. So I'm noticing that having the versatility in the Velcro mounts is great because I can make adjustments on the fly and get everything into the proper position when I need to, but it leaves a lot of room for inconsistency. For example, my thighs here are a bit low and my cod is a bit high, and this is very easy to do when I'm changing the position of the mounts every single time. So this is something I'm definitely keeping mental track of for when I go back in to make adjustments later. Finalizing some of these positions and adding snap mounts will add consistency to the fit and look of the final costume, which is what I want. But there's no need to worry about that until all of the parts are in play. For now, I'm just enjoying being done with the armor and feeling like a clone. Alright, I think that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for tuning in. A huge thanks to Commander Gats for sharing all of his build tips with me and making this process so much easier. I think the next logical part of the build would be to do the belt, but I'm still waiting on a few parts for that, so I think instead we're going to go right into some Clone Commander accessories, and the next video is going to be all about the radio pack, so stay tuned for that. As always, we're going to finish with a progression shot. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.